All right, Eric, whenever you're ready, we've got our last panel of the day, Falcon GIS map. Go right ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I hope you've been enjoying this as much as I have, because I've certainly been watching with great interest, watching and listening all these great people with all of their knowledge and experience. It's been wonderful to hear and see what's been going on. My name is Eric Bloomquist. For about a year, a little while ago, I worked at UMass Libraries as a digital scholarship resident. And one of the little projects I was working on towards the end of my time there was the first version of Falcon Map. And a little while ago, they contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to update the data. And eventually we talked about it, and they gave me a contract to do that and to do a little bit of redesign to take advantage of some new capabilities. So I am in the middle of that. So what you'll be seeing is a prototype, and hopefully some of you will have some ideas in terms of what I can add to this going forward. And in fact, I've already picked up a couple ideas and made notes as other folks have presented. So I'm going to do a screen share and a short presentation, and then I will demo what I've got so far. Okay. Let's see about screen sharing here. Share screen. And here we go. Okay. Is that showing up? I guess it is. Okay.
Yep, it's all set.
Okay, good. Oops. That didn't work. Hang on. Tried to mess with it. Okay. Where did that? There we go. Okay. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about where the data comes from that I'm using in the map. Then a little bit of how I handled the data, and a little bit about how I created the map. And then we'll get to the demonstration. I'll give you a quick demonstration of what I've got so far. And after that, some closing remarks and any questions that might come up. So the data I've got comes from the U.S. Geological Service. They have a bird banding laboratory. Regulations under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act require a permit for people to band birds. And the USGS Bird Banding Laboratory collects records of the bandings and records of later encounters with those birds where people have identified them from the bands. And the Bird Banding Laboratory basically collects all that data. And they cooperate with their equivalent organization in Canada, the Bird Banding Office, under the North American Bird Banding Program. So between the two of them, they have 82 million bird banding and encounter records, including 1,156 different species, of which peregrine falcons is one. For the falcon, the peregrine falcon data, they have about 70,000, just slightly over 70,000 records. Most of those are original banding records. Some of them are later encounter records. Oops, this has popped up. Sorry about that. And they date back the earliest records, and this was a surprise to me when I first looked at the data. The earliest records they have are from the 1920s, which is pretty impressive. The Bird Banding Laboratory has an open data policy. You can go to their website, request the data from them. it says to allow 3 to 6 weeks to receive the data, and you should probably, to be safe, allow that much. But I want to tell you that a couple of times that I've requested data, I have literally gotten it later the same day. The person who handles the request is very good and very responsive, and I was happy to have that experience with them. Okay. So each of the records, each of the banding records contains 40 different data elements. And some of those elements actually refer to other lists of values. So it's more complicated than you might think, all the data involved, most of which I didn't include in the map, basically just sort of the basic pieces of data for each record. One of the interesting things about the data is that some of the records are exact locations. Most of them are approximate locations. And one of the fields basically says, okay, how precise, excuse me, it's a slightly different word, how precise is the location for this particular record? So the bird banding laboratory response request sends you comma-separated value files, which can be quite large. Separate files for banding records and for encounter records. This is what the files look like. For the Peregrine Falcons, the 2 files got back totaled over 20 megabytes of data. Luckily, I'm used to looking at data this way and figuring out how to put it in useful form. So I loaded in the Excel files, pared it down to a subset, what I consider to be a subset, interesting subset of the data, and combined the encounter data with the banding data to basically normalize so that they would fit together, right? Because the slightly different field names, but you don't need to worry about that. I need to worry about that. And then I imported that Excel file into ArcGIS Pro, which is a piece of desktop software by a company called Esri, ESRI, who definitely one of the bigger names in GIS software. Their software is actually, as software goes, pretty good. I've been pleased with what I've done with it so far. Although there are certainly other options out there, including something called QGIS, which is open source based GIS software. So after I brought all the data into the desktop software, I ran something called Geocoding, which takes the data in the records and figures out how to place that on the map, essentially. Place that in the software on a map visualization. So that's called geocoding. For anyone who doesn't know, and I should have explained this up front, actually, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, which is a loose category of software that has to do with spatial data. So I loaded up into the ArcGIS Pro, did a bunch of detailed things that you don't need to worry about, and then uploaded it into ArcGIS Online, which is an Esri product that is used, one of the Esri products that's used to create and share location-based data, such as interactive maps, basically share it out to the public or share it out to a particular company or a particular group. So down at the bottom there is very simplified diagram of what I went through just to get to the point where the data is in the system for me to design an interface. So ArcGIS Line has different approaches to coming up with interactive maps. A lot of it is set up so you don't do any specific coding, or you do very minimal coding. And it all depends on what kind of data you have. I mean, obviously it's all got some sort of location link to it, but these days that involves more and more data from all sorts of different fields, anywhere from construction and transportation to medical to all sorts of uses. Certainly, many of you this past year have probably seen various sorts of interactive map software covering the COVID pandemic in various respects. So that's all done with various sorts of GIS software. So it depends on what kind of data it is, who's going to be using the data, and what they're trying to use it for. So with keeping those things in mind is where it comes into play in terms of designing the user interface. The approach I ended up using for this particular redesign, not for the original one, but for the redesign, is something what's generally known as a dashboard. Again, probably if you looked at COVID maps, interactive COVID maps on time, they were probably some form of dashboard, which is just a form of interactive data visualization showing multiple pieces of information that are generally interrelated, and through the interface, you can explore them in different ways. You can filter the data, you can zoom in on particular areas and get more of a sense of what's going on. Just remind you, what you're about to see is a prototype. I'll be working on this for at least a couple more weeks. So if you have any ideas, any feedback, I would love to hear it. And now, time for the demonstration. Okay, here we go. So here we are. This is because of performance constraints that I am hoping to be able to deal with in the process of doing the redesign. When you load 70,000 different points into this, it tends to slow things down. So what I've done, at least as an interim measure, is basically used only the data from the year 2000 forward, which, as you can see, is about 30,000, a little over 30,000 points of data. That's both banding incidents and encounter incidents. And what you can do, you can sort of see, while the data has been collected by the US and Canada, some of the records come from down in South America, some up in, actually you don't see them here because they're before 2000, but for the entire data set, there's actually a few who ended up in Europe, at least one or two in Japan somehow, which is interesting. But in terms of the year 2010, everything is in North and South America, North, South, and Central America. Now, there are various ways that the end user can interact with this. As you can see, you can zoom in and zoom out. If you want to take a closer look at, say, Massachusetts, there you are. And sort of right off, you can start to see interesting things just by looking at the way the data is presented to you. You can see a cluster in Boston, a cluster along up the North Shore, and a cluster along the Connecticut. In fact, all the way from southern Connecticut, all up the Connecticut River Valley through Massachusetts, and in fact, up into Vermont. And as somebody mentioned earlier, peregrines like being around rivers, obviously, because that's where a lot of their food is. So, and you can just see that. You can see that right from there. In fact, you can also see that over in the Hudson River Valley, various, clustered around the Great Lakes, down along the coast. So you can definitely see that they have that attraction to water just from looking at the map. So the various ways I've got it set up so far to filter the data is by state or province. So you can just say, okay, let's simplify this, just look at Massachusetts. Or by what's known to birders and ornithologists as flyways, you can say, okay, I just want Central North America, actually Central US. So it narrows it down that way. You can filter it by sex. If you just want to look at the records for the females or the records for the males. And if you're specifically interested in only banding, for instance, banding data, you click on that and you can see it narrows it down quite a bit. And as all this filtering is going on, obviously you can sort of combine things. You can say, okay, I just want the banding ones in Alaska, and it does that. And this automatically updates to say, okay, this is how many reports you're looking at. So in Alaska, there have been, since the year 2000, there have been 404 bandings of peregrine falcons. Another thing that I've set this up to do is that as you filter it, this down here updates. This is basically a timeline showing both the bandings and the encounters over time. There are a lot more banding records than there are encounter records. Probably 90% of the records that we have, at least through the USGS, are banding records. And sadly, a lot of the follow-up encounter records are basically records of when people find dead or dying birds. Not always that. Sometimes people, can spot them, and for however they do it, can manage to make out the banding codes. But that's what you have. So you can sort of see what's sort of, again, just looking at this, just glancing at this, you can sort of see an interesting pattern in terms of the blue line is the banding, how many bandings there are over a period of time. And you can see this little double hump here. And that is because, of course, a lot of the banding happens when chicks are still in the nest before they've fledged. So you basically got this little double hump of when they get banded during the breeding season. So, and the way I've got it set up, another interesting thing is you can just say, okay, show me this range of data, and it narrows it down by that date range. So if you're interested in a particular year, you can look at it that way. Oh, and there was this other thing that I've added, and I'm not quite sure how to integrate this yet, what the best way would be, but right now it's as a separate map. And right now, I've only got the data on this for Massachusetts, but part of the plan is to basically get the locations of as many webcams as I can find out about in the US and Canada and include them on this map. So right now we've got Massachusetts, at least the ones I know about. Here's UMass Amherst. And if you click on that location, it does a little pop-up. It says, okay, this is on the Du Bois Library in Amherst, Massachusetts, on the Du Bois Library building. And it has a link directly to the webcam, which I'm sure most of you recognize that. And let's look at this one. This is the Customs House Clock Tower in Boston. You click on that, and there it is. At the moment, it's empty. I don't know if they don't have falcons this year. Maybe not. Let's see. So, yeah. So I figured that's going to be interesting in its own way. And I'm trying to figure out whether to keep it as a separate map or to integrate it into the other map, which can be done. And one benefit, possible benefit from integrating into this map is that you basically can set it up so that you can look at, basically, essentially draw a circle around each webcam location, so you can get a sense of, okay, what are the busiest spots in terms of peregrine falcons being seen in established nests that are being covered by webcams. So I haven't quite figured out how I want to handle that yet. That's a possibility. I guess that's probably as much as I have to demo right now. So let's hop back over to the presentation. This is still on my to-do list, all these things. If I can improve performance enough, I want to include all of the data from the 1920s on. I definitely want to collect and integrate all the webcam locations, possibly do a thing where it shows the nearby banding as encounters. Something that I've experimented with and trying to figure out the best way to handle it is to provide visual links between the original bandings, the original banding of a peregrine falcon, and if it's been encountered later, where that's been. So you basically draw a line between it, which obviously is not necessarily and probably isn't the direct path that the bird took from the beginning location to the end location, but at least it makes the connection between, okay, we first saw it here and we ended up seeing it over here. Open about tests. A couple of things that I noticed during other presentations is that some of the things that were said earlier, and I need to contact the folks to ask them about this. I'm wondering whether the USGS actually has all of the data in terms of the original banding data and the encounter data later. So I'm going to look into that. And if there is additional data, we'll try to add that to the system. And also, I hadn't really thought about it, but if the data is in such a shape that I can use it, the genealogy would be interesting in the sense that you could click on a particular record and it would show you the records of the ancestors and the descendants of that particular banded falcon, as long as they had, as long as the ancestors and the descendants had been banded and would show up in the system. So that's an interesting possibility that hadn't occurred to me until just today. We'll see if that's possible or not. Couple of links to the bird banding laboratory. Like I said, they're really helpful folks. They really want people who have an interest in the data, particularly researchers, but not just researchers, to get in touch with them, because that's what they're there for. And also the website for the Esri GIS products that I use. And big thank yous to Carol Conner for reaching out to me for the update and redesign of this map. Simon Mean, the Dean of Libraries at UMass Amherst, and to my former boss at the Digital Scholarship Center, Brian Shelburne. Okay, so on that note, if anyone has any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Hope I haven't lost them.
Oh, we do have a question here.
Okay, good.
Is there a link to this info yet?
There is not. Like I said, this is just in a prototype stage. So I will be working, once it's sort of out of that stage, once the Falcon team at UMass Amherst sort of says, okay, we're ready, then it will be, they'll either have it sort of somewhere in conjunction with the Falcon Cam or have a link to it from there. So watch that space. And I'm sure that if you're connected on social media to the Falcon Cam folks, I'm sure they'll put it out on there as well.
We have another question about who the ideal users are for this technology, this Falcon map.
Uh-huh. As far as I'm concerned, the ideal user is anyone who wants to look at it. Anyone who's interested in Falcon, the peregrine falcons, and interested in basically the history of the data that we have on them to the extent that they've been banded. Obviously, this data does not include any peregrine falcons that have not been banded. As somebody was referring to earlier, there are a lot of peregrine falcons that just never get banded for whatever reason. People don't know about them, or they're in inaccessible locations, or what have you. But in terms of the birds that we have data on, that's going to be there, and anybody who's interested enough to look at it should look.
Any other questions from the audience? You can always reach out to us too on Twitter, on social media. We're happy to answer questions there as well if your question has not been answered yet, or if you think of one later. We're happy to field any of those questions, even if you just want to say hello. You know, we love to hear from that too.
I have to say that one of my blue sky daydreams, and something that's come up when I've talked to people about this in the past, is, okay, this is just peregrine falcons. What about all the other banded birds? And that's a really good question. But that would take a much larger project than this is to do. I would have to say it's theoretically possible, but it would definitely take some significant resources and some significant interaction with whoever does it and the USGS. But it's fun to think about.
We have one other question at the moment. There is DNA work on Massachusetts falcons. Do you have any plans on integrating that at some point down the line?
Oh boy, that's another thing that I had not considered. That's a great question. There's maybe that would be great. I could see that being it would tie directly into the genealogy data and back that up and expand it, I'm sure. And it would be, yeah, that's great. I'm gonna have to put that on my list as a future possibility. And sort of coincidentally, one of my earlier jobs, I've worked in various things with various sorts of data, but one of my earlier jobs was working with genetic researchers. So just the thought of, ooh, yeah, genetic data, genetic data about peregrine falcons, let's play with that. So thank you for that.
And then another question is, so will data be uploaded as sightings have been received by USGS?
Good question. The way the system is set up now, it's basically a kind of involved process to put the data into shape and to upload it into the system. So right now, the data is only up through the end of 2020. In terms going forward, it depends. Basically, it depends on the folks at UMass Amherst at the libraries about whether and how often they want it updated. What I would love to do is to be able to somehow tie it directly into the database that the USGS has. Right now, there's no way of doing that. Maybe someday.
And another question for potential things to include down the line. Will you eventually include data on non-viable eggs and what toxins may or may not have been recorded?
Oh boy, that's a whole nother thing, isn't it? Yeah, that's a good question. I will also add that to the list. That would be great.
And I think that's actually time. So thank you so much, Eric. We're really excited. Once this goes live, we will definitely be broadcasting it on the Falcon Twitter account, on our social media, so that everyone knows that it's there and they can use it.
Great. That'll be good. Thank you all.
All right, so that's actually our last panel of the day. So this concludes the very first FalConference of 2021. Thank you so much to all our panelists and presenters, our collaborators, our partners, all of you attendees for joining us today. This has been so much fun and super informative and just a great opportunity for all of us to get together and talk about something we all really love, which are the peregrine falcons. Just a quick note, we will be making the recording of this available as soon as we can get it captioned and transcribed, because accessibility is very important to us. So once that's all set, then we will post it on the FalConference page for everyone to be able to view afterwards. And
Laura, this was great.
Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful.
It was a lot of fun. I'm really excited because this may be the first one, but it's not going to be the last one. So we'll have to make plans for future years. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I think we're going to close out for the day. So have a great weekend and, keep watching the Falcon cams.